Well, hey everybody, I'm Nick Pettit at NickRP on Twitter, and today we are going to learn how to make a favicon. So let's get started. This is actually something that I blogged about recently in a post called How to Make a Favicon on the Treehouse blog. We're going to talk about how to pronounce it, some of the design challenges involved with making a very small image, as well as browser compatibility, how to deal with high-resolution displays versus regular resolution displays, as well as how to deal with some of the difficulties when trying to refresh a favorite icon. So we're going to get into all of that. First up, though, I want to talk about design, because favicons, or favorite icons, are literally smaller than a postage stamp, which is usually used as a hyperbole to describe a low-resolution image. They're even smaller than that. If you're not familiar, a favorite icon is the little icon that appears in browser tabs or in the address bar of your browser. So in this blog post, I have a couple of examples that are a bit larger so you can see them. Here's Instagram, YouTube, and Apple. So they have these little favicons right here. There's also Wikipedia and a couple of other brands here that have favicons as well. Pretty much any professional website is going to have a favicon. Now, I mentioned there's some controversy in how to pronounce it. I've heard it said favicon, I've heard favicon, and I haven't really heard any kind of consensus. The most I've heard is favicon, so that's what I say. I'm sure there's many people that will tell me that I'm wrong. That's okay. But the pronunciation isn't really important. It's actually the technical details and design of favicons that can be a little bit tricky. Now, let me show you why it's so difficult to design one of these small images. I'm going to go to Facebook brand, or let's see, is it Facebook branding? Just going to type it into Google. Yes, facebookbrand.com. And this is Facebook's official brand resources, so you can download their logos, like buttons, all sorts of screenshots of their mobile apps and desktop apps, and so on. So I'm going to download their Facebook logo, because if you were making a small image like this, you might take your logo and just resize it in Photoshop, right? So I've downloaded this as a zip. Oops. There it is. And there's a couple of different file formats here. Here's a bunch of PNGs. So I'm going to take this high resolution one and pop it into Photoshop. So there's what it looks like. Let's open up Photoshop and bring that in there. And let's say that you were designing this logo and it was time to make a favorite icon. There's actually what it looks like at full resolution there. So it's pretty high res. So we're going to resize it to a typical favicon size. So let's go to about 28, because I believe that's Facebook's favicon size. Now if I zoom in here, you'll see all sorts of junk happening around this nice blue background and white F letter. You can see all sorts of pixelation occurring that isn't really very good. It's basically a situation where some of these pixels are kind of falling between two of these larger pixels when it gets resized. And so it just takes this average and it ends up being a very blurry image. Now, if we go over to Facebook and let's say we go to /favicon.ico, and that's where a favicon is typically stored. So if you go to /favicon.ico on any website, it's sort of a special file name that's treated similarly to index.html. It's just a default that most servers will recognize. We can grab Facebook's favicon here. Although I'm actually just going to screenshot it so you can see exactly what it looks like in the browser tab. So I'm going to take a little screenshot here. And let's go back to Photoshop and open that up and see what it looks like. So it should be on my desktop. There it is. Let's see if we can tear off these windows so we can compare this easily. So let me crop this just so you can see what's going on here and make a fair comparison. Here is the one we resized, and here is what Facebook's actual Favicon looks like. So you'll notice that this actually looks very crisp and clean. They very intentionally made these white pixels here. The blue pixels here are very cleanly separated. You don't get all this kind of junk going on here where there's a gradient between different colors of blues and whites. And then they also added a pixel perfect shadow just below that. So one trick when you're designing a favorite icon is to not actually resize it, but instead try to draw it pixel by pixel if you want the best results. However, that can be a little bit overwhelming if you've never done that before. So one other trick, if you do just want to resize your logo, is to change the way that the image is resampled. So in most image editing programs like Photoshop, you can adjust the image sampling. So if I were to resize this, say 32 by 32, and we resampled using the nearest neighbor algorithm instead of the bicubic, we'll get slightly different results. So let me zoom in so you can see what this looks like. And here, we don't get any of that blurry stuff happening. We get very crisp and clean separation between the two different colors. Now, this won't look perfect as a favorite icon. You will still need to do some pixel by pixel editing, but it will get you much closer to a final result that looks like this. So if you need a really solid starting point, that's a great way to do it. And then you can go ahead and edit using the pencil tool in Photoshop to make pixel by pixel adjustments. So let me see if I can do that right now. So you can just click with the pencil tool just like that to edit one pixel at a time. And you'd be surprised, it actually doesn't take you as long as you'd think because the image resolution is so low. There's actually not that many pixels here for you to even edit. So you can do it pretty quickly. It is still a bit tedious, but it's not terrible. So, on a larger note, when you're designing favicons, you want to make sure that they are representation of your brand. It's not always best to just go with your logo because your logo might not look good at small sizes. It might not be a square enough image to look good as a square favicon. And some tricks that different brands use is to use maybe their logo mark or a single letter that strongly represents their brand. So if I go back to that blog post and we look at these examples here, you can see Instagram actually just uses the Instagram logo, although there's no text with it. They don't have that scripty Instagram logo text with it. Apple is a really solid example. They have the Apple logo, which is recognized worldwide. It's really meant to be put absolutely everywhere, so they've done a really great job of making a logo that also works as a favorite icon. However, if you look at some other brands here, YouTube is another example, but also Wikipedia, Disney, Google, and to some degree even Facebook, they don't really have a logo that necessarily works perfectly as a small square favorite icon. So they've done an approximation that is representative of their brand. So for example, Disney has their trademark D here, which isn't their full logo, but it's recognizable enough that people will know what it is. Same with Wikipedia. They have this very unique W here, as well as Google. They have, this G here with the blue Google color. So if you can't make your logo work perfectly, you can use a logo mark, which is a close approximation of your logo. Another tip is to not use any kind of text because at these sizes, although it may seem obvious, it is worth mentioning, text is not going to look good. Now, when you're designing in Photoshop, you want to start with the largest size and work your way down. So it depends what types of platforms you're trying to support, but in most cases, if you're just trying to make a favorite icon, you can go with 64 by 64 and then work your way down. So once you have a good 64 by 64 version of your logo, you can then make a 32 by 32, a 16 by 16, and a few other square sizes. So what are those square sizes exactly? Well, I want to show you something called the Favicon cheat sheet. This is a page on GitHub that has all sorts of great information about how to design good favorite icons. Now, one thing you'll notice right off the bat is that there is an ICO file format. We'll get into how to export files using the ICO format in just a little bit here. But typically you can use a .png to create the ICO file. Now let's get back to image dimensions. You'll need 16 by 16 and 32 by 32 at the very least. This is the minimum that you can create for a favorite icon and get away with it. This is the default required by Internet Explorer. And if you use a PNG in addition to ICO, Chrome and Safari may pick the ICO over the PNG. So it's almost always best to actually just go with an ICO. Again, we'll talk about how to export that. But if you look at these different sizes here, if you're very obsessive, you can create all sorts of different favorite icon sizes, ranging from 32 by 32 all the way up to 228 square. So what are these? Well, the first one is just kind of a basic size that's going to work on a lot of different browsers. If you want to support iPad and other iOS devices, such as iPod Touches, iPhones, and so on, you're going to want to create a few additional sizes here. Now, if you put these in the favorite icon file, they may not necessarily come up. You're probably going to need to use additional markup, which you can find here, where you use the rel attribute in your HTML to say, that this is a touch icon and you want that to be on Apple devices. We're not going to get into that. I'm actually going to make the distinction between those touch icons and what is typically known as a favicon, because we're just going to talk about favicons in the browser. However, that's just something to keep in mind. If you do want to create those touch icons, this is a good opportunity to do that. You can make them at those larger sizes if you choose. Just be sure to start with the largest size that you want to support and work your way down. A couple of these others are for iPhone at Retina sizes. Of course, there's probably not too many iPhones out there that are not Retina anymore, so it's best to go with this larger size if you want to support that. There's stuff for the Chrome Web Store, IE10 Metro tiles, Opera, and so on. So you can get pretty in-depth with this. However, we're just going to create an ICO file. So there's a few sizes that we want to support. Today we're going to do a 16 by 16, 32 by 32, and 64 by 64, but there's a few other sizes that you may want to support. If you want to do Windows site icons or IE9 pinned sites, you can do 48 by 48 and 24 by 24 in addition. So this cheat sheet is super handy. That basically covers cross-browser compatibility. So if you're wondering about how to make a favorite icon that's going to work across a lot of browsers, this is a great place to look. One other tip is that you actually don't want to mention your favorite icon in the HTML. You'll see this on a lot of websites. They'll use a HTML tag, I believe it's a link, to reference the favorite icon, but it's actually better to just not reference it at all and just put it at /favicon.ico, and that will work all the way back to Internet Explorer 6. And I think there's only like one really obscure browser that's really old that's not going to work in. It's mentioned in this cheat sheet as well. So just go with favicon.ico if you want the broadest support and you want to do the simplest thing possible. Obviously, you can get more in-depth with that and use ICO and PNG files if you want to, but most of the time it's really not worth it unless you have a very specific audience that you know you want to target, whether that's in older versions of Internet Explorer or particular mobile devices and so on. So we're just going to make a favicon.ico. So let's look at some tools that will allow us to do that. I'm going to go to xiconeditor.com. And here you'll see this wonderful editor that allows you to upload your imagery, and then you can place them into these various sizes, so 64, 32, 24, and 16. And then you can export it. So let's see what that looks like. Let's grab another file. So let's actually go to Treehouse and see if we can take this Mike the Frog image. Actually, I take that back. I'm going to go someplace else. Let's go to Facebook and let's see if we can grab their favicon. So I'm going to save this out just to my desktop. And there should be multiple sizes in here. If there's not, we can try something else. Oh, yep, it doesn't look like there's multiple sizes. So let's try Apple. And let's go to favicon.ico. There we go. Let's try that one out. Doesn't look like they have 64 by 64 supported either. Well, instead of doing this and importing an ICO, let's do what we would normally do, and let's go into Photoshop and make our own favicon real quick here. So I'm going to create a new file, and I'll make it at 64 by 64. I'm going to zoom in so I can see the pixels here. Can I see them? Nah, not quite. That's okay. I'm going to make a few shapes here. And let's say we wanted to make a favicon that was just a plus button here. So we'll drag this out. This isn't going to be perfect. I apologize. There we go. So let's duplicate that layer and rotate it here. There we go. So that's our favicon, and obviously it's really simple, and we want it to be pixel perfect, so I went with a very simple shape. So we're going to use the Save for Web feature. If you go up to File and go to Save for Web, it'll bring up this dialog box, and you can save it as a PNG 24-bit file. So let's do that, and we'll save our 24 version. So we'll call this favicon, or I'm sorry, our 64 version, favicon 64. Now we need to resize this, and again, I'm going to use nearest neighbor instead of bicubic. So let's do 32 by 32. There we go, and you can see how this resized. It's still pixel perfect. I'm actually going to undo that just so you can see what it would look like if I used a different image sampling algorithm. So let's do 32 by 32. It's a little hard to tell, but even at the edges here, you can see that it's not quite pixel perfect. There's already some blending happening. If I were to make this even smaller, I would imagine that additional blending would be happening along the green and white areas. So let's go ahead and do what we were doing before using nearest neighbor. We'll make the 32 size, save that out. By the way, the hotkeys I used to do that are Command, Option, Shift, S on a Mac. I don't know what the Windows hotkeys are off the top of my head, but if you just go to File and Save for Web, you'll be able to see the hotkeys right next to it. So let's save that for web. Again, it's not perfect. You can actually see that it's slightly off center. I'm going to pretend that's part of our branding for some reason or another. So let's save that out. We'll say Favicon 32. And let's do a 24 version because I believe, yes, Xicon Editor supports that. Now, while I'm doing this, one other thing I want to mention is you don't have to use Xicon Editor. There's a number of those different tools that will help you create those ICO files. In fact, I think a while back there used to be a Photoshop plugin that would do it. I'm not sure if that's still available or if it's free or what, but that might be something to look into. There's also realfavicongenerator.net. So that is a good resource as well that can help you generate these. So just look around, use the one that you like. You don't have to use the one that I'm using. It's perfectly fine. So now I've got all of our various sizes here, 64, 32, 24, and 16. And I'm going to go back to Xicon Editor, and I'm going to import these images. Now, I can import these one at a time. So let's say I want to do my 64 one first. And I have this image here, and I'm going to say, I just want this to be my 64 version. So I'll hit OK, and bam, now it's 64. Now I can do this for the other sizes. So here's 16. I probably should go in order here, but that's OK, doesn't matter. And let's grab our 24. There we go. And then finally, I'll get my 32 size. There we go. Now, like I said, it's slightly off center. Please excuse my rushed icon here. You should spend a little bit more time designing it than I did. Now, looking at these different sizes, it looks like, look at that, we have a slight problem with the 24 version. And my guess would be I didn't use nearest neighbor resampling there. I probably used bicubic. So let's go back and see if we can undo the damage there. So image size, let's see, 24, nearest neighbor. Let's see if that gives us a better result. Yes, it looks like it does. So Favicon 24, place it. Let's go back, import, upload, Favicon 24, and check off 24 there. See if that fixed it. Yes, it did. Okay, so that's probably what happened there. So now I have all my different image sizes, and as I click around on these, you can see Xicon Editor actually gives me, you guessed it, a pixel editor here, hence the name Xicon Editor. So there's a couple of tools up here that are similar to Photoshop. You can click the pencil icon here and start editing. I'm not going to do that. If you don't have Photoshop, this could be one way that you could actually make a favicon. I think that's kind of crazy to try and do, so avoid that if you can. It's best to do this in a more robust tool like Photoshop. So now we have all of our images here. We can say export, and it says your icon has been created correctly, so that's pretty cool. And now we can export our icon, and now we have this nice little favicon.ico. So I can show this in the Finder. And, you know, I wonder if I just open this up in the browser, I bet it will show up in the upper right. Not quite. So it looks like I'm going to actually have to bring this into a web page. So I'm going to open up Sublime Text here, and just going to take my favicon here. Actually, I'm just going to save this actually real quick. So let's make a new folder called website, and inside I'm going to say index.html. I'm not actually going to put any HTML in here, at least not yet. And then we can move our favicon over to our website folder. So let me do that real quick. Say website. Now let's see if that did it. Not quite. There's probably something else I need to do there. Well, one thing I do know is that Treehouse actually does have the Favicon referenced in their HTML. So let me grab this here. And let's see if I put that into index.html, if that will bring it up. The browser should be fairly forgiving here, so I actually should be able to see this just fine. Aha, there we go. So you'll notice I didn't actually have to put any other markup there, just putting the link to the Favicon was enough. So now it's displaying right here in our browser tab. Now, something that you might run into when you're creating favicons is difficulty in refreshing them. This is a difficult error to reproduce if it refreshes just fine, but I'm going to try to reproduce it here. So I'm going to make some markings here just so we can see that this is a different favicon. Just going to use Xicon editor to mark these up. And now I'm going to export this again. Now I have another favicon.ico. So if I drop that and replace the file, then I go back to index.html and try to refresh. Oh, look at that. It actually worked perfectly. So this is actually a bad example. However, a lot of times when you're developing websites, you'll find that it's very difficult to refresh the favicon. It will just stay with whatever your favicon was previously, and for whatever weird reason, the browser will just hold on to it and it will cache it very enthusiastically. So a way to break that cycle and make the browser think that it's actually a new file is to add a query parameter to your favicon. So if we go back to Sublime Text here, you'll notice that I actually added this into the HTML. Normally, you wouldn't want this there. For best compatibility and something that'll work on many browsers, you don't want to have this here. You have to have a pretty specific reason to be using a PNG and other various files. However, if you're trying to refresh it, you can add this line to your HTML and then add a query string just like this, and you can put V for version, an equal sign, and then a number. So maybe this is version 2, or it's the third time I've tried this, and so on. Now, this query parameter, by the way, could actually be anything. I could put any text there, and I could put any number there, and the browser is going to think, oh, here's a new variable, here's the new value for it, but just doing this version is an easy way to understand in your markup what's going on in case you accidentally leave that in for some reason. So if you need to refresh your favorite icon during development, you can say version equals and then a number. And when you go back to the browser and upload that new HTML file and refresh it, you should see your new favorite icon up there. So there's one other thing that I do want to touch on. If I go back to this favorite icon cheat sheet, you can see down here, there's a way to create, actually, I think that's in my blog post. So there's a way to make dynamic favicons. And we actually have a good example here. With Treehouse, we change the favicon if you have a new notification. So I have a notification right here, and even without looking at that browser tab, I can see, oh, there's a little number 1 there, and that will tell me that I have a notification. There's a couple different ways to do this, but one way is to use favicon.js. So there's a link to this, and it is a GitHub project. Hopefully it comes up here. And you can see what it looks like, and I can actually increase or decrease the number here. So if you look up right here at this little tiny area, I'm not sure if that's showing up, you can increase it or decrease it, and it will change the number right there. You can see a much larger version here, so that's basically what's showing up there. If you just look here, that's what the Favicon looks like. That's a little bit more advanced. You don't have to do something like that. You should really only do it if your application has some kind of notifications or similar construct involved. And you should also be aware that it's not perfect yet. There's a couple of issues here. Particularly, it doesn't work very well in Safari or Internet Explorer. So that could be a big holdback for a couple of people. So that's pretty much it. At this point, I think we're ready to take some questions. So hopefully have some good questions lined up for me. I hope you guys learned a lot. So Lee asks, would you ever use Illustrator for making favicons so you don't have to worry about pixels? It depends. You have to be pretty good at using Illustrator and really understand exactly what you're going to be exporting. Oftentimes, it really is best to just use Photoshop. So if you're really good with Illustrator, you know exactly what's going to be outputted at different resolutions, you can do that. But oftentimes I find that when you're creating those vectors and you try to apply an image to some very small resolution like a favorite icon at like 32 by 32 or 16 by 16, it just doesn't produce the best results. It doesn't always look good. Sometimes it does, and you can get away with it, but oftentimes, I mean, really every time I've made a favorite icon, I find myself doing pixel by pixel editing. So I do recommend you use Photoshop if you can. Next up, Travis asks, what are the advantages or disadvantages of using other formats like PNG over ICO? Well, ICO is going to have the broadest browser support, and in a lot of cases, even Chrome and Safari are going to favor an ICO file over a PNG file. So if you have both, if you have an ICO file and a PNG file, it is going to oftentimes pick the ICO file instead, which is pretty frustrating if you have a really nice PNG, maybe you have some really detailed alpha transparency on it that you want to produce. That's something we didn't talk about, but you can make transparent favicons and they'll pretty much work across almost any browser if you do a transparent ping at, I believe, 8-bit. It should work. I don't think 24-bit transparency will work perfectly. But when you're exporting your favicons and you're using a tool like Xicon Editor, you want to export them from Photoshop or your image editor as PNG files because those will be pixel perfect. If you do a JPEG file, it's going to apply JPEG compression, and you certainly don't want that, especially at those smaller file sizes or smaller image sizes. You want something that's going to be pixel perfect. So export them as PNGs, and then you can bring them into a tool like Xicon Editor or Real Favicon Generator or whichever one you like, and it will generate a nice ICO file that should be pretty cross-browser compatible. So a couple of people, I guess, are asking about animated favicons. You can do it. Again, it's going to be pretty tricky. The thing that is going to help you do that is the tool we looked at just a minute ago. I think I had it up. Let's see. Yeah, there we go. Favicon or favico.js, excuse me, so there's no N there, could help you do those types of animations. And if you look here, there's actually a number of different animations here. So if I plus or minus these, you can look at what these different animations look like. So they have a fade or a pop here, a position, and you can certainly do that. You could use some of the technologies that were used to make favico.js here and maybe apply them to a different kind of animation. It doesn't necessarily have to be a number here. That's a little bit more advanced though. So if you do that, just keep that in mind. It's going to be a little bit trickier, but it can be done. It's technologically possible. So I think that's all we got time for. It doesn't look like we have any more questions. Be sure to check us out at teamtreehouse.com, the best place to learn web design, web development, mobile business, and so much more. I'm Nick Pettit. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we will see you next week.